Hello, how are you? I cannot hear the answer, but I hope well. Today, it's important for me to share with you how much musical grammar should be taught, assimilated, integrated, besides and beyond the very strong intuition that a musical gift is. We try to make it up for talent. It's like a rational way of looking at things, because when one learns in school, elementary school, how to write the language that one already speaks, how to read the language that one already speaks, intuitively and by ear. So the phonemes vehicle the meaning, but to develop the thoughts, the intelligence, the capacity to evaluate situations, in other words, to be cultivated through humanities, languages, science, literature, without to become a writer, a philosopher, a mathematician, an architect by any means, but we have to learn these things from elementary school onwards. And mostly the language skill, I think, is very important, because many musicians play by ear or by finger for pianist memory, which makes them a bit more susceptible and vulnerable when the piano doesn't respond in the action as they hope, since we always play different piano, different instruments that we have to shape into what our inner ear hears. So of course those things are part of the intuition, a part of the oral tradition that we received since babies in our native language. Music is not exactly a language, but I think it does need, while appealing to the senses and to the emotion and connecting to an inner world of introspection, or perhaps accompanying the moods of situations from movies to own life, to have this kind of coating of music, either to dance, either to pray, either to just listen actively, is a musician who wants to take part in a performance of a piece they like to hear and they can't play, so somebody or some people play for them. And I don't deny the importance of the inherited in the genetic material that creates an option for some who are aware of it, or brought to be aware of it, that they have a musical talent, to develop it. And what does that involve? Does it involve to dry down all the intuition? I hope not. At least I don't believe that. Is it easy and simple to use different tools, exercises, technique, practice learning, type of memorizations, in order to have a culture of sound, a storytelling in the performance of the piece, as well as an understanding of the language of the given composer we serve when we play, regardless of the authenticity, because that's questionable. We play different instruments for music written in the past, for other instruments. I would say that all this translation leads to an intelligent and, I would say, cultivated tone extraction from the sound of the piano, and not just for the sake of the sounds, but also for the meaning of the poetic way that music tells us things about our own inner emotions, yearnings, expectations, angst, anxieties. Also, the music is full of psychological igniters in us. So we either visualize something when we hear music, either we analytically frame it into our understanding, but a little of both is good. a lot of grammar is best. So that is one thing which I find to be a necessity. Not because it discourages, as some people think, because theory by itself without practice seems to be always not appealing. And the most reasons for which musicians, let's say, play the piano is because they love the sound of what they hear, or in the combination of the sounds that the composers wrote, and they hope to learn how to play, therefore capture and nurture and arise a technical aspect of touch control, of articulation, of independence, of uneven fingers, to make the possibility for the fingers to become one's orchestra and one's musical understanding to be the conductor. And of course I believe in the composer too, because I think that inevitably the creativity that comes in interpretation can ripple off into composition. All those words are big and strong and say, oh, I'm not a composer, but I like to. Or somebody says, oh no, too much was written before me, why would I? So it's not an obligation either, it's a calling. And it's an extension of what you do when you, let's say, obediently practice piano as a child to please somebody, parents, teacher. And then you start realizing it's meaningful for you enough as a young adult to continue. And sometimes you give up because it's not rational to live out of music, and you prefer to build something solid for yourself in terms of career and leave the music as the favorite pastime, which in grand amateurs of the past was what they did. The Waldsteins, all these, the patrons of music. So I think that the professional musicianship is in anguish, but that is a situation to deal with how to organize one's life's income through music making. And the commercial aspect of music, in the length of training it takes, is not a good business idea. It's a lot of investment for a lot of decades, and there is no guarantee that you would grow in wisdom and your talent will blossom, be recognized, and then you will contribute to your interpretations as a pianist to enrich the repertoire. Of course, that's something that is in the yearning of most pianists whom I teach. Chamber music, music theory, all these elements of music making start appearing often later after one starts playing the instrument, which is deceptively too easy to start on compared to other instruments, but nevertheless brings you an inner joy even to just try to touch some keys and see how that sounds. So the curiosity, the ear, the emotion, the sensitivity, the capacity of concentration, all these elements bring you to start harnessing a little bit this soulful relation that the melody leaves for you, or a harmonization coating. And I think that I believe, at least, I don't know if I think it, but I believe it almost like a faith, that you cannot be a good pianist if you're not an instructed musician. Yes, you could play by intuition. Some pieces don't work like that. Some musical languages of some composers don't give in so easily. You have to study their language in order to penetrate the audacities and the beauties that remain opaque if you can't. And I know that most people say, if I hear it, it doesn't matter that I can name it, which is true ultimately. But nevertheless, and that is where I think the major problem occurs, is that when one develops early enough, if one has enough lessons and treatises to prepare you to learn about what you like to do is originally a pastime when one starts very early. And it seems to me like it is clear that once you get into memorization aspects of a piece, you cannot memorize them without to know the harmonic progression of the piece. I know it's easy words to say, but it can be bypassed by the incredible strength of intuition of the ear. It doesn't mean that, well, in that case, this person doesn't need any instruction because they already feel it, they don't have to explain it to themselves or to the others. And what do you do when you teach? You start explaining things that you haven't really verbalized even to yourself. So you do analysis of the structure of the phrase, of the structure of the piece, the architectural understanding of the construction that you're playing. And then starts the stylistic choices, the artistic choices, which are to do with stage projection or just the way you inlight or highlight or incandescent light the texture with the inner voicings or outer voicings or any voicings. So you build taste for a sound palette that would be like, yeah, the sound background, like in a landscape, I would say a soundscape. And then you have to have the capacity to deliver it with rational evidence once you practiced it on any instrument. So you have to be able to count on your own individually and independently of your fingers rather than the fingers moving, pulling you towards the piece, but you want to let the finger play in autopilot, which you practice by repetitivity, but then you have to constantly be intellectually focused, concentrated to hear what you do, anticipate what you do, memorize the gestures of how you're going to do it pianistically, in order to serve musically what you think the piece should be or what you got to grow up to believe that the piece is. And sometimes an interpretation by a given person all of a sudden breaks down all what your certitudes were about the piece as a listener or a performer, mostly as a performer, and then you try to rise up to the standards of your own expectation. And it's a very, very delicate time because you're a young adult, you want to reach a point where you, as a student, going to be no more a student, but be in the active musical life, regardless as a teacher, performer, chamber musician, musicologist, theorist, reviewer, scholar, festival organizer, competitions founder. It's all different ways. Of course, not all of them are directly involved in the playing, orchestral conducting, or choir, and the ensemble is a vehicle to bring musicians around an idea rather than just alone on your piano trying to find how to express these things, which in a way, without the grammatical knowledge of music, the syntactic knowledge of a phrase, become just repetitivity until you get in the muscular memory. But the first inevitable mistake happens in public performance where the pressure is bigger than in solo practice, obviously. And then you get lost. You don't know where you are in the piece. No GPS, no map. It's frustrating for the performer student as well as for the teacher who thinks that, and it's true, that a lot of technical practicing can secure and move away from this instability on stage according to the emotions of the fear on the stage, people listening to you by holding their breath. It makes you feel like more responsible not to mess up the piece, or the sections where you think you usually mess up when you practice. And then other things happen. The unexpected always happens in public performance, but you deal with it in real time, provided you have already the map of where you are in the piece. I believe that this is a very important aspect, to not let the music theory portion of the musicianship become a separate entity, like some kind of medicine that you take when you have the flu or something, because it has to become part of your daily life as a musician, to know the harmonic progression of the piece you play, to know where you are in terms of which tonality, when does it modulate. Formally, where is the recap, how does it enter, how does it treat the second theme, in which key, if there is a such second theme, the rapport, the relation between the tonalities in the structure of a construction of a sonata, which is more a form than a suite of pieces, but you also could do that for short pieces. In other words, the curiosity brings you to learn about what you love in the first place without to be able to name it. And I think that there is no technique, obviously, that suffices by itself, but there is no artistry without the technique to express oneself, or then one accumulates frustrations and disappointments and loses, as a student, sometimes self-esteem, thinking, oh, it's never going to be good enough. Some fatalism. So as a teacher, I personally like to be very honest and respectful of the student by telling them an assessment after a recital, a jury, an exam, or a situation of a milestone during their studies. At the same time, I'm very encouraging, because I don't believe that just judging helps. What helps is to, with experience, if trusted by the student, the teacher can give the the prognosis will come after, but first you have to give the assessment of what is that could create various causes that reach various weaknesses during performance. Is it a lack of repetitivity in the practicing, of concentration in the details, of a capacity to overwhelm yourself with the music that you play, like on tracks that you imaginary place and you have your train go through, and be untouched by the public audition situation, because obviously you don't practice in front of people, but when you perform, you play for people, or through the people, still to play the piece, and the meaning that you want to serve the dead or living sometimes, but mostly dead composers of the past, which in classical music we all serve in the present time, not in a museum pastime. But the fact that when you have an audience listening to you, or an audience of judges who are there to pass your failure, if you're in a scholastic situation, you're stressed to play clean, to play well, to play acceptable, to be reliable, not to be having any major memory slips or memory induced troubles, like reaching the wrong harmony in the left hand, often on the piano, not knowing in which key it was anymore, because somehow the stress overtakes the rational knowledge of the piece. And I think each student learns by themselves how much of repetitivity takes them for the brain cells to record it. And often when you replay it the next time, day or week later or 2 days later, whichever distance, you realize how much has vanished from what you thought was solidly learned. And so you have to re-practice it, to strengthen it. And so it takes resilience, it takes courage, it takes abnegation. Of course, it's a self-serving situation where you try to improve yourself. Nobody's born playing the piano, but as the appetite grows, so does the appetite for the repertoires. And so you feel like you never have enough technique for a given piece that you would like to play, or dream to play, or you're asked to play. And it ends up by being a race behind the horizon line. Well, you never reach behind the horizon line. That's the whole point. And thankfully, it makes you run faster trying to reach the horizon line. So this analogy is, I think, necessary, because I think painters finish the work and it stays there, and people see it with their eye and their intellect and the eye of the beholder, as they say. But he or she doesn't have to repaint it every day. We replay it from scratch every time we finished, when we have to redo it. And all of a sudden you have to have the technician, the strategist, the inspired artistry that gives you the desire to continue working on so many details of the piece, which can become tedious. And every masterpiece brought down to details can become tedious while heard or played through when known. It sounds like the most marvelous path to have for one's inner dreams, and daydream in musical terms of expressions that perhaps are more or less symbolically attached to your life. But yes, you do. Music does have that action profoundly to enhance, solace, or excite our inner yearnings. When you hear the beginning of the Mozart D minor concerto, syncopations of the delayed harmonies, the rolling beats of the downbeats of the bass, you feel you're on unstable terrain. If you start the beginning of Waldstein Sonata by Beethoven, you find some more squareness in the fact that there is no syncopation in this case. No melody, but it's part of the accompaniment. In a way, you expect something to happen, but there's no melody. The melody is in the accompaniment pattern. And so you have, as a student, very often, I think, one has a diffuse idea of what the piece means, either because of being heard before to be played by others, and then when you look at the score and with the help of a teacher or by yourself or listening to other interpretations, you start making sense. What did the others see in the same piece as I do? Perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps they're wrong, and perhaps there's no right and wrong anyway. But to be honest, at some point you reconnect with your intuition after you have studied about it, how it's structured, how it's organized. How will I play the pedal? Many times my students play pedal as an insurance policy they purchase in order to cover up for something that might happen, meaning accident. But it blurs the structure. Not all pieces have a harmonic pedalization. Sometimes you have to make sure that you, I think at least, melodically, when you have passing tones, that you cannot, and you shouldn't, let the pedal make of them sort of clusters of notes, diffuse chords. And since the piano is polyphonic by essence, and can play many parts at the same time, I think the piano is the best instrument to play very easily, not well, but sounding okay. And once you try to implement everything that you realize it's important in the piece with the instruction of the text that you read and the information about the stylistic ways of approaching this, where are the ornaments, how to organize them, how to think about being creative with the undetermined melodic lines, with decorations or perhaps with grace notes, and all of a sudden you have to be able to discern in your reading the meaning of the details versus the structure of the whole. How you organize your tempo because of the pulse, because of the meter, how to organize the understanding of how you want to go through the different aspects of the piece while you play it, and how to think in real time and ahead actually of what you play of the next section. And so that when you negotiate the next section, you already have the intellectual and, of course, physical preparation. So you anticipate what you have to play, but you're your own anticipator. Like, you don't have a conductor beating a beat ahead for you to make sure you don't slow down. You have to count yourself independently of your playing. And I know that if one reduces a piece of music like the first prelude by Bach, it's not very appealing. It's more like a skeleton. But meanwhile, you can do that with any piece you play. Of course, it takes longer if it's a complex texture to analytically understand what is essential from what is frivolous. And sometimes you have to make sure that the choice of a voicing brings a certain aspect to the piece, then that calls for another section to justify it. In other words, yes, there's the intuition, oh, I love it, you know. But what if I want to? And then immediately comes a question, should I be playing it that slow? What is slow? What is fast? How do you organize the pulse and the thought? So I think that also you have to know it's in B flat minor in this case for this waltz by Chopin, compared to this one in C sharp minor. Of the chromatic and temperate tuning of the piano, we all use the idea of the unison and the chromaticism. That means that we could play. Does it teach us something about how we'll play it in the real key? Besides the topography of the terrain that changes? I think it's because it allows you to own the piece as if you wrote it. And if you did really copy it by hand, you really know it better through the macro when you play and micro when you write. Because you're into the details of every detail, you're at the level of the ground. And when you perform, you're above the ground and you just oversee the piece and you just deliver it by series of phrases or collisions of phrases, whatever the textures and the styles of the given composer ask for. But you have to have these two understandings of the harmonic progression and how it doesn't reach right away its point of, let's say, perfect cadence in the tonic by doing the deceptive cadence that delays, or the plagal cadence. So you learn about how the punctuations in the piece are written. You don't have to breathe on the piano, but you have to breathe musically and beyond the rhythmicity that's indicated on the score. So when I hear people rightfully say, oh, I play the music because I just feel it, I don't need to know it. In other words, I don't need to name the ingredients, I just play them. And I don't believe that naming the ingredients is necessarily making you play it better. It's just that it gives you, or should provide you with sort of a extra track other than what you play and you hear, is how you think the section in which you are, how you anticipate the next section in order to not mess it up. Every gesture that is correctly implemented according to the teacher, for instance, with experience, should avoid you having an accident, which is not avoidable all the time. You play the wrong note, the wrong key, the wrong I don't know what. But I still think that once one knows the whereabouts while playing the piece, the memorization is less fearing, because the muscular memory and the finger memory have its limitations. Though it has great advantages on short term, you can play on autopilot, as I like to say, well, many people say. And so the amount of time it takes to interiorize all the details and to deliver the pieces if you composed it varies from one person to another, just as humanity is a beautiful diversity of human beings. And just because we have an text score and rigidified rules about how we play the grace notes or we don't, or how we play anything, at some point overlearning all these grammar things about music can or could, I hopefully doesn't, dry out the initial drive for which you do it in the first place. And I think that it can be fascinating, the moment, when you realize, oh, this is where the theme reappears. I didn't see it before, even if I play through it. What does it help me to play it better? Probably not, per se. And what better means, it's to be determined. But informed, yes. Curious, yes. Following different paths every time you play through it. You have to solidify the fingering so you don't change them while you play until the next time you play it, but not during. And therefore the internal hearing of the piece, how it brings you from point A to point B, etc. What is the main point of given punctuation, and how will I integrate this in my desire to show virtuosity, if it's what the movement calls for, or interiority for something more introverted. I know these are banalities that I'm saying, because it's obvious to anybody that that should be the case. The problem is that the performance requires so much repetitivity in its acquiring of the knowledge that sometimes people don't see the point of it, or lose the aim for which they were doing it. And it's very important for the teacher, I believe at least, to encourage, in order to keep the balance between hope and expectation through discipline. If you only do the discipline, I don't know many people who choose it, but at some point, yes, it's necessary, and throughout as well, but not only. If you cannot explain to yourself why you like a bridge like in a Ravel sonate, it just sounds good. Oh, it feels good. It's true. It is atmospheric. It's like cold and hot, or I don't know, rough and tender, texture. It's all the senses. It's not just the ears. Through the ears, you vibrate innerly to a music that is dramatic or traumatic even, and sometimes so dreamy and peaceful. And sometimes just enigmatic. You don't even know what's happening in the piece. What am I supposed to follow? What, as a listener, let alone as a player, what am I supposed to bring out? It's not always clear in the score, and it doesn't matter. You build a culture by knowing more about this piece or other pieces, or etc. So everything brings you to become knowledgeable. And I think that the best blend is to be able to integrate the grammar of the piece while let yourself flow and float through the performance of it. Only controlling during the performance is impossible, because every intense concentration has weaker moments. It's human. And so you need to have enough of this muscular memory to make up for the moments where your brain is a bit lagging, or just on what you play, which is already behind. You have to always think ahead, like the conductor does, but of course the conductor doesn't play. So it's an inner dialogue, duality, contradictory sometimes, between your inner conductor and your performing fingers and feet with the pedals. All that monitored by the ear and organized by practicing with a metronome, or then counting by yourself. In other words, you learn how to go through the piece, not only as a series of obstacles and hurdles, but also in a meaningful storytelling way, regardless what story you have in mind in your inner imagination, but something that conveys a certain answer that you give to the enigma of how it's supposed to be and what does it mean. I mean, artworks by essence don't reveal many things specifically, of course with lyrics more specifically in music, but even without. And then it becomes a soulful necessity. That's why I encourage students, while I teach them, to think about, the rapport of the tonalities, how the rapport of the degrees, which kind of chord they play, what is a cadenza, what is a punctuation. These things take time, and time is of the essence when everything is so expensive, and so people try shortcuts because they have enough intuition to make it up. On short term, you can do that yourself, but if you want to respect yourself and have a teacher who respects you, then they try to open your horizons to manage to enter in the texture of the piece and say, oh, this is what I understand of it. And that's how I'm going to serve you this modulation. And what if I had to make a modulation between these keys in the piece and the other key? How will I do it if I were to do it? And then, of course, you play how it's written, but you have a capacity to think a little bit outside of the box, not in order to not play, hopefully, as you think it's supposed to be, but to see the purpose of how it's structured. It doesn't hurt to, not about some kind of irreverence to question the piece. It's not the point, but it is helpful to imagine how the composer would have done differently in a specific detail of a bridge between two thematic materials or anything. It becomes like an inner dialogue with the inner thought of the composer, who, of course, composed and died a long time ago. And you arrive and you visit it, and it means to you the world. Oh my God, it's so beautiful. But is it because it's A major? Perhaps not. And perhaps it was tuned like that, and people thought it was that key. So it's all relative for that. But then on the other hand, it's not in minor. And what do I do with the arpeggiated answer on the left hand? If I took much pedal, then I hear the harmony 1-5-1. But if I played it reminds me of the F minor book 1 by Bach in the right hand. And here. Arpeggios are diluted chords, and the chordal progression is, but that is blunt. The melody is simple. The accompaniment is predictable. The bass is rising through degrees, from the tonic to the dominant, sometimes to the 6th degree before to go to the dominant and back. Then you have relative minor, then you have plagal cadence. Okay, you have different ways of expressing your thoughts as a composer, and you just left it written, and you bring it to life when you play it. It's no more just dead signs on the paper or on the screen of a tablet today. It comes alive. And it's almost like you give birth to the piece again. I mean, it's a bit overstated as a statement, but you have the feeling that you're visiting it. Even if others did before you, and many will after you as well, you feel like that's my time to play this piece because I love to have known it from inside out. I played. I could also say I rather listen to it because it gives me the same pleasure without so much effort, in fact. Although the effort of listening is very intense because it obliges you to be actively listening to elements of the piece that blend with the pedaling, harmonization, the melody, the secondary voice. In a way, you have a lamp torch that you show through this to the audience by highlighting things and not others. And if you do too much of that, some people consider that it's too much customized, too personal. But inevitably, it is personal. It's about how much it means to you to play it as you think is what brings the most meaning to it, regardless if it's the exact meaning that the composer had in mind, because that is a totally different subject, since composers come up with the piece, but somehow the interpretation of the piece is part of their imagination. But I don't think it should be locked in only because the performers can see differently the piece and love it as much as the composer, or differently more. But it's more than love. It's meaning. It's connecting. It's I become the piece while I play it, like an actor becomes the role. Or the character that the actor is playing, not just playing, pretending, but really believing and make it believable for the listener. And I'm afraid that while people in piano try to acquire skills, which takes decades, technical skills of finger independence and velocity and strength and physical relaxation of the shoulder, of the elbow, of the forearm, the wrist, and then the strong support by the palm, the articulation from legatissimo to staccato, the wide range of options, and then the acoustics to take in account, the pedaling that will harmonize or melodize. Every time a student brings me a piece, I feel like I rediscover the piece to the student while I'm trying to shape the student to play it the way I hear the piece. Ultimately, if I sense that the student doesn't buy, so to say, my conviction in the piece, as long as I can, what I do, help them then express it the way they hear it, less slow, less driven, more driven. When Germans indicate often in their scores like etwas langsam, somewhat slow, it means, but we cannot tell you how much exactly, even with the metronome marking after Melzel's invention in the early 19th century. Nothing is objective, it's all subjective, it's all what it means to me. And who would lock themselves up in a practice room for hours of a lifetime if the result is not the aim, that in a way the journey is the aim itself, of course, philosophically, but towards an aim that, regardless, like the horizon line analogy might never catch, but we lean towards. That's why I believe that a sensible pianist needs to know the grammar of the music in which they play, the language, the structure. It can give them their own opinions about how to play a redundancy or not to play differently, the redundancy in the structure. In other words, they appropriate themselves the text and they become the momentary, ephemeral composer on the spot while they play the piece. When you teach it, you have to put words on those things that are not all wordable. That doesn't exist as a word, I know. But to define the undefined, the analytical facts are more factual, of course, that's self-evidence. And how the composers use the meter and the amount of bars, and how do we hear and think outside and beyond if our phrase is overlapping a certain group of bars. Bars are just convenient chopping of the thoughts, but not the direction of the line. Of course, ideally one should write barless, then one feels like the flow goes from the beginning to the end. But there are always so many episodes in the middle, in between, and places you go, we call it when do you reach the climax, and then what do you do after the climax, or the climaxes in the pieces, or is it necessary to chase for that, and how to dosage your hairpin in English, the expression box with crescendo, diminuendo, and all of a sudden it becomes too much or not enough according to your taste for this and that style. All these thoughts live in me when I am involved in helping a student who trusts me to help them go beyond the way they hear or play or practice, because that's how they're used to it. Try to bring them to a higher level, higher step. Sometimes it doesn't happen linearly, and sometimes doesn't happen while I'm their teacher. It happens after they left to go elsewhere, and that little by little these things filter through, and they say, oh, that's what he meant. Thank you.